I can say that I'm stunned that some of you are still here. I've got the coveted 4:30 spot on Friday. By way of disclosure, I don't have any industry links. I work in tobacco, food, and cannabis. My disclosure is that I take research funding and testify in cases on behalf of governments. And I also realized, full disclosure, I think I ripped my pants coming up here, so don't look too closely. It's not often that a government gets to create a market from scratch. And the question is what should that market look like? And we fall into the trap of talking about legalization as if it's a binary state, illegal, legal. But of course, it's how that legal market is regulated that will determine the public health impact. And one of the big questions is how should advertising and marketing be regulated? Now, if you read, the daily article in the news, and most of it comes from economists, you'd think that the government's job is to sell as much cannabis as possible. But of course, this entire framework is being driven by public health, and the objective isn't to maximize the amount of cannabis, but to maximize and protect public health around cannabis, and there's different sub-objectives. And that is a very important distinction when you think about how much advertising and marketing we'd like to allow. And I think that on all sides, there's consensus that, well, we should have some restrictions. We shouldn't promote it to little kids. So the question becomes, well, where do you draw the line? And this is an ad that I stole from last week's New Yorker, and it's obviously from the US. But, somewhere underlying these decisions is the issue of proportionality. Anytime you restrict free speech, commercial rights, we have something called the Oakes test. And it says, well, you can do that, but it has to have some benefit, and it has to be proportional to the benefit. And you have to minimize the amount of impairment or restriction for the benefit. So we need to figure out that whatever restrictions are placed on the industry, they're proportional to the outcomes. So it begs the question, well, if this is all about public health, what is the purpose of advertising under a public health framework? How does advertising advance that public health goal? And when you talk about advertising, there's two things to remember. There's primary and secondary demand. Primary demand is the overall demand, how much is used, how many new people come into the market. Secondary demand is things like brand market share. So the first one is overall, does the market grow or shrink under legalization? And the second one is an issue of, well, which types do they use within the market and what types of brands? Now, companies have an interest in both of those. I think the government and public health interest is in primary demand and ensuring that we're not promoting it beyond its natural state. And a lot of times when you hear the industry talk about demand, they focus on brand shifting. And we need to advertise because we need to give consumers about different brands. But we know, of course, that advertising can influence primary demand. It can influence how products are regarded, social norms, and whether people actually take them up. And I was here last year and I showed some of these slides, and I've spent a lot of time in court cases reading industry documents, but one of the best examples is in the 1920s, smoking rates were really going up among men, but not among women. And in some cities, it was illegal for women to smoke at the turn of the century. And so the tobacco company said, well, how do we change these social norms? How do we increase the primary demand? And you figure out what people like, and then you associate your product with that thing. What do women like? They like to look thin. And this is in Mad Men, the HBO series, and it was called the Reach for Luck Instead of the Sweet, or what they called it internally was Avoid the Future Shadow. And the idea was we have that big person lurking behind us unless we smoke. You market cigarettes. If they're seen as unhealthy, you market them as sort of clean and pure. You associate it with babies. You associate it with women's independence. And there is an unreasonable number of ads that feature women and dogs. And I'm not, the whole #MeToo thing, I don't quite think that's appropriate. But just to illustrate the importance of brand imagery, Marlboro was originally a very unsuccessful cigarette marketed to women, and it didn't go anywhere. Now, they changed the product itself, but they also changed the branding to the point where Marlboro remains one of the top 10 most valuable trademarks and brands in the world. And it was the opposite. It was Marlboro as male virility. And this is how you advertise to affect both primary and secondary demand. And if you were to trace tobacco consumption over the last 100 or so years in Canada, one of the most important environmental changes was both the increase in advertising in the first half of the century and then the restriction in advertising in the second half of the century. And you can see that tobacco consumption peaked right at the point and started to drop after we started reducing advertising. And by the way, we started to meaningfully restrict advertising 40 or 50 years ago, and we're still not done. So plain packaging for cigarettes, the bill actually just got final reading last week. So this has been a 50 to 60-year process for tobacco, and we're designing that system overnight for cannabis. And what we've learned throughout that long history of natural experiments is that it's the youth and young adults that are most susceptible to advertising, especially as it relates to primary demand. And I'm not going to read this, but I think some of you have the slides. And the tobacco companies, through court disclosure, they've had to open up their marketing documents. And it says, you know, kids don't start smoking because of nicotine. You have to want to pick up the cigarette and inhale it before you get the nicotine. They start for psychological reasons. They start with the image, if they think it's cool, if they think it's fun. And those are the perceptions that are driven by advertising. And of course, we know this from food marketing. Canada is now regulating food marketing to kids. I always point out, you know, if you look at the little characters on the cereal packages, usually the eyes of the little characters look down. That's because the little kids are shorter, and as they walk by the aisle, it feels like the cartoon characters are looking at them. And we have lots of examples of how you can do this explicitly, but you can communicate messages implicitly. And so when the companies brought out light versions like Marlboro Light, which were promoted as being less harmful, they couldn't say it on the pack because they knew, A, that it wasn't true, and they're likely to, you know, create some liability for themselves. So what do? They use different colors. You can see the chevron, that it's not just that it's gold. You see how it's smaller and there's more white around it? Well, if you read their own documents, they designed that because people associate more white with healthier. So you can shape norms, you can shape perceptions, even using implicit ways. And I always use this. If you looked at print ads for Marlboro Red, the full flavor, you saw dark horses. For Marlboro Light, they used white horses. Again, why? Because white is less harmful. This isn't sort of made up stuff. This is research that Philip Morris and other companies conducted. And it's not limited to things like tobacco products. If you look down the chip aisle or soda pop or cream, you always use the darker colors for the full cream, higher fat, higher sodium, and the lighter colors for the others. So sadly, this works on humans, as does references to natural organic. And what's interesting is in our tobacco marketing laws, something can be objectively true but still be misleading. And that's the case with tobacco products, where it can be objectively true that it's organic or additive-free, but they're prohibited from doing that because it makes people think that the products are less harmful when that's not the case. So that brings us to how much cannabis advertising and promotion should be allowed. Well, if you look at the industry position, I think there's a lot of representatives in this room. They put out a proposal for what they think would be reasonable restrictions on cannabis advertising and marketing. And it includes, you know, reasonable principles, like it should be adult-focused. But it's really important that you pay attention to the language. It says advertising cannot be directed to or appeal particularly to young persons. And I'm going to come back to that. So that's the content. It shouldn't be particularly appealing. And in terms of where they should or shouldn't run them, they said, well, we'll only advertise on TV, radio, et cetera, if at least 70% of the audience is over 18 years of age. So what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that you could run ads on Blue Jays games. It means that you could run ads in Hockey Night in Canada, because it's a proportion. So young people in Canada, let's assume every Canadian watched a TV show. Well, 30% of them are typically going to be below 18 years of age. So if you look at the viewership for these, you can have lots and lots of kids watching it, but if there's enough older adults watching it, then you fall below that threshold and you could advertise. And actually, they're very similar to the voluntary code of advertising that many food companies have. So I pulled this off of Coke's website the other week, and it says, we don't advertise to children under 12. And if you look, and this is a verbatim, it says that they use words like particularly. We don't directly target children under 12 years old. We don't advertise to children under 12 years old. We don't advertise to children under 12 years old. And it's the same principle. Because they can demonstrate that those things are appealing to older people, because of the people that those marketing channels reach, it still might be 30% of kids below 12 years old. In fact, that's almost every TV show except for kids' cartoons. It's the same thing with energy drink manufacturers. They don't target primarily to an audience of children. And it's fascinating. I do work in energy drinks, and this is from the Red Bull site. What do they have on there? They have video games. They have music. They have parties, and they have skateboarding, and they have things like BMX. And I remember once there was a representative from Red Bull who said in public, "I don't believe that BMX advertising targets kids." But this is what it looks like when you talk about particularly targeting, or you use that denominator of 30 or 70%. In practice, what it means is you can almost market in any channel and almost any time. And even if you do restrict yourself to adult-oriented channels, of course, the things that appeal to an 18, 19, or 20-year-old often appeal to a 14, 15, or 16-year-old. You see that with alcohol marketing, you see it with tobacco. And so tobacco companies would always say, well, look, we designed this for adults. And even where it was true, it still doesn't mean that all of a sudden it's a distinct content that doesn't appeal to kids. And the other content guideline from the industry was they said, well, we're only going to promote a brand. We're not going to promote cannabis in general. We're not trying to change consumption, and we're not trying to imply that you should consume these. We're only marketing our brand. And even when that's true, it's very difficult in practice to draw the distinction between promoting a brand versus promoting consumption of the product. And again, we have 20 or 30 years of seeing this in cigarettes. So this is, you could say this is all product information. This is all brand-specific product information. And yet we know from doing experiments that kids find this very appealing. They start to think that tobacco products are tasty, and it increases their interest and appeal for trying them. There's lots of different examples there. And you know what they've done in the U.S., for example, where they have print advertisements and things like that, is they put a warning on it. But you can't counteract the impact of an advertising with a warning. I made that up myself. That's not a real warning, but that is a real e-cigarette advertisement. So that's what the industry would have liked to have seen. What will actually be allowed, at least as far as the Cannabis Act is proposed at the moment? Well, it has restrictions on anything that could be appealing to young people or encourage its consumption. It will allow information-type promotion, so ingredients, THC, CBD levels. But importantly, it says that the promotions will only be allowed where youth can't see them. And that's the biggest difference, I think, with what the industry was proposing and what's in the Act. So it can only be, for example, in adult bars where you have to be 18 or 19 to enter, direct-to-consumer marketing, or in the point of sale or price. And there are some exceptions for brand element on other things, but again, it can't promote a lifestyle or be appealing to kids in any way. And the other thing is, an extension of that is how it should be packaged. And you know, we're about to have plain packaging for cigarettes. I was talking with someone earlier, I said, I call this plain packaging-ish, because this is an example of what cannabis products will need to look like. So it has the wrapping has to be opaque. It has to have that cannabis symbol, that thing that says THC. And the background color has to be one uniform color, but you can choose the color. So you can make it green or orange or red or whatever you want, but you can't have stripes and things on it. And see where it says company name? Well, they are allowing you to put a logo there, but there are restrictions on the size. You can see that there'll be a warning. Here's another example. So there will be logos, there will be some different colors, but there's restrictions on the number of colors and the size and what those logos should look like. So that's what cannabis products at the moment will look like. And I told Hanan to throw something at me if I'm getting this wrong. And I think that the special restrictions on packaging were partly based on what we've known about how effective packaging can be for targeting young people, for targeting certain genders. You know, if you want to design a cigarette for young girls, that's what you make it look like. And in fact, that's exactly what Philip Morris said when they were designing the packaging. There'll be other information that is required to be put on the package. You can see some of it here. You can see the THC and CBD levels. But one of the arguments that's being made in favor of allowing more advertising is that people have argued that it's required to reduce the illicit market. And so, you know, this is a quote, the LPs believed it was vital for the industry to have the tools to push back against the thriving illegal market. This was from 2 days ago in the newspaper. Someone said that the danger of plain packaging is that the illegal and legal product will be largely indistinguishable from each other. And then they went on to say that it's essential that the legal industry has ways of making itself more appealing than the illegal alternative. Well, I sometimes wonder, I've heard that argument many times, I sometimes wonder if the people that say that they won't be able to discern the difference between legal and illegal, if they actually know what it's going to look like. Nobody is going to confuse that for an illegal product or vice versa. I've never seen an illegal product that has a big warning on it like that. So I don't think that's a compelling argument. As to, and let's be clear, I am not equating the tobacco companies or industry with the cannabis industry, but the principle has been made. In fact, where I've heard that argument before is in court in several countries where, and this is an ad from one of our tobacco companies that says plain packaging is loaded in favor of criminals. Now, people have said they haven't done themselves any favor by representing cigarettes as bullets, because this comes from one of the tobacco companies. But they've made this argument. But you know what? Plain packaging has been introduced in several countries now, and there is no evidence that that's the case. What we know about the illicit trade, when you have a legal market competing with it, is that it's other factors. What products are available, what price, and how accessible they are. That is what will determine whether people shift from the illicit market, not by making the product more appealing through advertising. What I think will be really interesting is point of sale promotions and differences between different provinces. This is from, I think it's Colorado. What I think will be fascinating is, as you all know, we'll have different retail frameworks. Some more privatized stores, some more government-run stores, like the CBO, did I say that right, in Ontario? But this is our LCBO that sells alcohol. They do lots of marketing of alcohol. They have a lovely, this is their website from the other day. They have a lovely magazine called Food and Drink. And some people have said that some public health folks are in favor of the government running retail stores. Some of them worry that this now provides an incentive for governments to market them. I think it'll be fascinating to see, and I think where we'll see it most is inside the retail and point of sale. Now, with a couple minutes left, I want to talk about, this is a sad attempt at a segue, but government advertising. So if you think back to the public health objectives I showed you, one of them is to increase people's understanding of risks. And the packaging, so part of it is what the industry gets to put on it. The other half is what I've already showed you, is what the governments get to put on it. So they've said, here's the cannabis symbol. So this is meant to help people say, aha, that's a cannabis product. And in theory, it's particularly important for kids to recognize what it is. So that's what ours will look like at the moment. And there are different versions in different US states. Ours looks quite a bit like the one in Oregon. And I did a highly scientific study with my 3 children who range from 4 to 10. And I showed them the ones from the different US states, and I didn't tell them what it was. And I said, which one do you like the most? And I said, I like that one, Daddy. Because this actually looks like a brand, doesn't it? This looks like a pretty appealing brand logo. That's the one in Washington State. And when we talked to my kids about, well, which one actually tells you shouldn't have it, this is the one that they said, no, I understand that I shouldn't have that product. So I think it's interesting that we've chosen sort of a stylized version. Now, we did do a less scientific study with 1,000 other people where we showed them the different ones, and this is the one that people clearly says this isn't for kids and this is a cannabis product. Anyway, we'll find out. The other thing that was released was our health warnings. So the government is proposing 6 different health warnings. There are the 6 topics: smoking, pregnancy, driving, addiction, youth, and psychosis and schizophrenia. I do a lot of work in health warnings, and I've done some different interviews, and people have very different thoughts on them. And I thought, just for 1 or 2 minutes, I know it's Friday afternoon, but I'm interested in what people think. And I don't think we have the time for people to volunteer things, but let's just quickly go through them. So one of the 6 warnings is cannabis smoke is harmful. We just had a question before about modes of administration and minimizing risk and really making it clear to people that smoke is the dirtiest mode of delivery that carries excess risks. I think this is what this warning is meant to get at. There's also a prevalent belief that, oh, cannabis is more natural, so the smoke is better for you, right? Wrong. The main difference with tobacco is just that cannabis users inhale smoke less frequently. The average smoker in Canada smokes about 15 cigarettes a day. It's just that they're exposed to a greater volume of smoke, but the smoke itself is just as toxic. Here's the other warning on pregnant and breastfeeding. And there's some information about the potential risks in terms of low birth weight, harm your baby. And I've put there's sort of secondary messages that have to rotate through on the bottom. So that's the one on pregnancy. We have one on driving or operating machinery after using cannabis and trying to communicate about some of the health burden from that. The other one is on the risk of psychosis and schizophrenia. I thought it was interesting that it's not general to mental health. It's a very complicated area. It's specifically focusing on psychosis and schizophrenia. There's one on adolescent use and that the risks, it's a very good predictor of problematic use. And then we have one on addiction. And trust me, from trying to design warnings for tobacco products for 20 years, addiction is the hardest message to develop a warning for. It's an abstract concept. It's a very multidimensional concept. And I think more than anything, these warnings will start a discussion about, well, what does addiction mean? Are there, can you have different levels of addiction? Is it more addictive than other types of products? But it's clearly one of the ones they featured. Now, you might note that those all have words only, no pictures on there. If anyone's seen a cigarette pack, you know that there's big, ugly pictures on there. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was intentional to try and maybe just implicitly suggest that there's a difference in risk between, smoking conventional cigarettes and using cannabis. The idea being that smoking is even more, especially harmful and deserving of pictures. I always note that this is from the Madrid Transit Authority, where they use pictures to depict the serious risks of man-spreading on their trains. I still think sometimes we're a little too reluctant to use pictures because we use pictures, when they put out the sign to say we're cleaning the bathroom, there's a little picture on that. The other thing that retailers will do is put in an informational document. It doesn't have to be affixed to the package, as I understand, but it might be a pamphlet or leaflet that goes in with it. So a lot of you will be familiar with the current consumer information document. I think it'll look a little different. I don't think the design is being publicly revealed yet, but there'll be an opportunity to give consumers some other information if they chose to do so. So let me wrap up. I would argue that if the government's goal is to advance public health, then the advertising regulations should reflect that and make sure that they advance those objectives and not just trying to increase sales. Bear in mind, it's easier to prohibit channels. It's easier to say you can't go on TV than it is to try and restrict the content and say, well, you can go on TV, but it can't be appealing to kids, because that is a very slippery slope and is quite a big loophole. And I think that some of the more interesting things we'll see is that interaction at the point of sale, and it'll be interesting to see how provinces differ. And I think that it's probably easier to loosen restrictions, to start a little bit more conservative and then say, you know what, things are going well, we're going to loosen the restrictions a little bit, than it is to claw back. And I know that this opinion isn't shared necessarily among all stakeholders, but look, I think the industry has a strong incentive of making sure that this process goes well, that people don't look at it and go, oh my goodness, look at the ads that were allowed, look at the problems that they had. I think the industry has a very strong and deep interest in making sure that not only is it viable in Canada, but other jurisdictions look at what's happened in Canada and say, you know what, that's reasonable. And so if some people see the government as being a little bit too cautious, perhaps that may even be in everyone's interest in the long term. So thank you very much.